Okay, so we're gonna do Q&A for about half an hour.
Repackaging of the manifesto as a green economic strategy is well done. It certainly galvanizes a lot of young people's support. The socialist team around Corbyn very much associated itself with Extinction Rebellion, as they had with Occupy. McDonnell sat in with Occupy the city of London the very first night that Occupy happened outside of St. Paul's Cathedral. And they've been very visible in this and have committed to net carbon reduction by, party policy is 2030. The manifesto says by the 2030s. They fudged it. But a resolution was passed at the party conference setting 2030 as the date for carbon reduction, of emissions reduction. It's not clear to me that that plays out in those areas in the old industrial heartlands of labor all that well. It's not that people aren't conscious of it, especially younger people. But I'm not sure it plays out all that well, and I think that also has to do with the unions. You know, they rhetorically sign on to this, but they don't have, as we don't, as Unifor doesn't, if you point to the whole Oshawa campaign, a strategy for industrial conversion. Even though in Britain, that is something that radicals in the labor movement have been on about since the 1970s, since the Lucas Aerospace campaign. So one of the reasons that Labour Party policy is not to support Corbyn on getting rid of the Trident nuclear submarine, which is going through a rebuilding phase, is because the Unite and the General Municipal and Boilermakers Union, the GMB, two of the most important unions in the Labour Party, most powerful, are against it. They see it as jobs for the workers. And instead of having a well worked out campaign for industrial conversion in Clydeside, which is where that's located in Scotland, and the Scottish Nationalist Party is in favor of doing away with the nuclear determinant. So it is possible, and they're winning all the Labour votes now. It is possible to win Labour voters with that. The unions aren't doing it, and it holds back the party, I think, to some extent. That said, any young environmentalist who's been involved in the Extinction Rebellion stuff is supporting it enthusiastically, I think. On the anti-Semitism thing, as I said, James Schneider wrote back to me when I proposed putting ads in the paper that he doesn't think that's very effective. And they're doing a lot on social media. But I think that, one really needs to get one's head around about, it's not all that effective in those industrial working class areas where people don't give a shit. It matters in the area around London. It doesn't have an impact, especially amongst what is known in Britain as the BAME community, which is Black, Asian, Middle East, which is actually a much better term for the diversity of people who are called black often in our politics. Their support for Corbyn is well over 70% in the polls. Well over 70% in the polls. And obviously this is not a factor as far as they're concerned. There was a danger that the Hindu community was going to do a similar thing. After, at the Labour Party conference, a resolution was passed, and Corbyn put it in his speech, the appalling invasion of Kashmir in the late summer, early fall. And some Hindu nationalists tried to do the same thing, saying that Corbyn was anti-Hindu and Labour was anti-Hindu, etc. But I don't think it's had those reverberations. Partly because Labour wasn't as defensive about it. And I think what one does have to stress, and here even John Lansman, who I've known for over 40 years, since he was a 23-year-old political genius who ran Tony Benn's campaign for deputy leader in 1981, he has been very defensive about this and very worried that the Jewish labor movement, which has been associated with the Labour Party since 1918, same time as the cooperative movement affiliated with the Labour Party, that they would leave the party. And it is, as I say, because I think, and this is especially, most of the people who've been expelled are Jewish. And there is a very strong sentiment amongst us Jews, given what the Israeli government increasingly is, let alone what it says, right? To be very vociferous in our anti-Zionism. But the effect of that in a large political organization that has progressive Jews in it, who don't see Zionism as inherently racist, even if they have trouble with Netanyahu, because most of them would have been Labour Party supporters in Israel, have reacted in a way that is very open to the appalling travesty that has gone on here. And since Labour has been defensive, and as I said, has expelled people for saying things like, why don't we celebrate the Holocaust in a collective way against other people who suffered other genocides? The defensiveness, I think, has really blown up in their faces, appallingly so. But I don't think that is what's turning this election. What it does do is it gives liberal opinion a basis to be anti-socialist. And it's a tremendous irony, because the working classes were diverted from their rejection of the status quo in the interwar period, in the Depression, by blaming the Jews. They were diverted by identifying the Jews. Now people are being diverted, right, by blaming the socialists for being anti-Jewish. What a historical irony. And they're getting away with it. As I say, I don't know how much it actually affects the working class vote. I don't think it's nearly as effective as it is over the liberal vote. But it has an effect.
Okay, I think there are a couple
Corbyn responded to the chief rabbi's appeal to people not to vote Labour. By the way, the chief rabbi also, when Johnson was elected leader, issued a statement welcoming Johnson's election as leader of the Tory party. Corbyn responded with a letter to him saying there is a specific form of left anti-Semitism which we have to cope with in the Labour Party. And that is generally the view of the team around him. And it does reflect what Judy's talking about. A very, I think, principled but blinkered position that anyone who has, explicitly Zionist affiliation is a racist. As someone who says they find it reluctant to make a direct comparison with apartheid South Africa, for instance, right? Whether that's accurate or not accurate in any way. Even someone in comparative politics would say that's very problematic in a lot of ways, no matter what's going on. They will be seen as the enemy. If someone is still supporting a two-state solution in principle, as opposed to, in principle, one state, which of course would be, in historic liberal terms, which one would opt for, right? Basic citizenship. That is seen as being on the other side. That sometimes goes with a rich Jew's trope as well. inside a left party like the Labour Party. So he wanted to acknowledge that. But of course, that ends up inviting it all the more, because the more you accommodate this, they don't stop. So what can one say except, I think that especially Jews who are critical of Israel need to have their priorities right. They need to have their heads screwed on. If they're active in the Labour Party, is it really the top priority to win Labour over to being anti-Zionist? Should that really be your top priority right now in this crisis, this political and moral, and ecological, let alone economic crisis? But they don't. And we know this from all kinds of movements. It's not just, people engaged in anti-Zionist campaigns. It's much more broadly. People tend to give priority to their thing, to the exclusion of everything else, and that becomes problematic. I mean, I don't know what more to say than that.
I just wonder whether people who are...
Oh yeah, so the real anti-Semitism, which there is, of course, you find it on the right. There's a tremendous video that David Graeber, the anarchist who teaches at the LSE now, did, which is going around social media and is hopefully having an effect, saying, what are you people talking about? If you need any support against vandalism of synagogues, you're going to get it from the Labour Party, from nowhere else in British politics. And he does it really well. And sure, there's anti-Semitism in Britain. I don't think it's rampant. Much less rampant than it is, I'm not even sure it's rampant in France, but much less prevalent than it is in France. Well, my position has been for a very, very long time, since the 1970s, since I was a young man, that you can't change the Labour Party into a socialist party, that you can't change elephants into gazelles. It's one of the reasons I've never been in the NDP. And in the book I did with Colin Lees, we're doing a sequel now, which was called The End of Parliamentary Socialism from New Left to New Labour. It ended by saying exactly that what that episode shows was that you can't do it, and we need to be forming democratic socialist parties outside of the Social Democratic Party. So when the Corbyn thing happened, I was totally surprised. And a young man, Max Shanley, who has virtually memorized that book of Collins and mine, contacted me, and I got to know him. He phoned me. I was in Greece at the time, all excited, saying, Corbyn has got the nomination. And I said, oh, that's wonderful, but he can't get elected. What do I know? And he was one of the founders of Red Labour, of that social media thing. So. What's Plan B? I think Plan B is that the socialists in the Labour Party, both the union leadership socialists and the team around Corbyn, although there's still only about 20 MPs who actually are in the socialist campaign group, astonishingly, that they would retain the leadership of the party, both the party apparatus and the leader's office. And in that context, Plan B would be what I was arguing, that you either would pass the kind of constitutional changes that would allow for the reselection of MPs by a radicalized base, so that socialists would become candidates rather than career politicians from Oxbridge, right, etc. I think that's the Plan B. What this amounts, if it's a minority government and it lasts any time, Labour would have to offer the SNP and the Liberals proportional representation. But one shouldn't get too excited about that. All of the new socialist parties that have formed over the last 2 decades are now in coalitions with social democratic parties in Europe. Every one of them, where they're in government, including Podemos now. Right? And Die Linke would like nothing better in Germany than to turn the kind of coalitions they've had at the state level, at the Länder level, to a federal one. They're not going to get it, but they'd like it. So it's not clear that there's more option for us right now forming new socialist parties than it is trying to change social democratic ones where there's enough of a socialist mobilization behind it. And it really does require, I think, a socialist union leadership in a party like the Labour Party to be able to do that right now. And that was crucial, I think, in the Corbyn case. I think what they're expecting, I'll just end with this, and people are looking past Corbyn, is to elect a Corbynista, and it's a Corbynista, a woman, as leader of the Labour Party. MacDonald should be the next leader in terms of capability, Marxist understanding, an ability to speak much better than Corbyn effectively on the strategy and what it represents. He keeps saying it's a woman's turn. And he looks very tired, I have to say, in this campaign. He's had a heart attack, and, not recently, but he looks very tired. So this is likely to be Rebecca Long-Bailey, who MacDonald has really promoted. She's the industry shadow spokeswoman. She comes out of a union background, although she has a law degree, I think, commercial law. There's a woman called Laura Pidcock, which a lot of the young people would really like to have. It would be great to get online, look at her maiden speech. She was elected in 2017, where she says, I haven't come to this gentleman's club to make friends with the Tories. It's a brilliant speech. So, they're looking past Corbyn. What I fear is that someone who was a Corbyn supporter will, like Kinnock, take over the leadership of the party. A lot of the young, not the union leaders, but a lot of the young activists who really matter are fairly naive politically. And if someone goes around quoting Gramsci like Kinnock did, they can easily be fooled. So there's a young black Labour MP elected in 2015 who was one of the first MPs to demand, in a letter in The Guardian with 10 others elected then, that they need to have a candidate who's anti-austerity. It was an important moment. Well, he was shadow defense spokesman under Corbyn. He's very telegenic. He's very pro-Europe. He fought in Afghanistan. He'd been in the military. A lot of the Labour left, the socialist left that wants to stay in Europe and reform it, Hillary Wainwright, think he'd be a good leader. When he was shadow defense spokesman, he went to the 2017 party conference, or maybe in the 2016, and said Labour Party policy is not Jeremy's policy to get rid of the nuclear weapon. Okay, he had to do it, right? It wasn't party policy, the unions guaranteed it wouldn't be passed. He was defense spokesman, he had to do it. But do you know what he said? He said, after all, NATO supports NATO has always stood for Labour's fundamental value of solidarity. Now, just imagine the miseducation involved in it. And it is not inconceivable that someone like that could be leader of the party. And then you could see the left, as happened with Kinnock, right, being mobilized behind a very different trajectory again. That's not unlikely, but it would involve getting rid of at least the Unite Union leadership, which is also possible.
Quote from the book you wrote with Sam about how the EU really has neoliberalism in its DNA, right? And yet, on the other hand, throughout the Brexit debate, I thought that Corbyn's position was actually the most sensible, which is that we should remain in the EU because we need to do so in order to deal with the global scale of problems that we face, in particular, capital taxation and climate policy. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on all this kind of stuff. Yes, the one.
The EU is not the main barrier, although, as Niko said, ever since the Treaty of Rome, it's been oriented to the free movement of capital. And that's where it was heading all along. And it's achieved it. But come on, the main barrier to socialist policies in Britain, including the nationalizations, including the investment bank, including even the very radical Keynesian fiscal policy, is the domestic ruling class. That's the main barrier. It's not Brussels. It's true that that ruling class, whether the Confederation of British Industry or the merchant bankers, etc., would happily encourage the Europeans to be their front men. But the main barrier is that. If that wasn't there, you could imagine that a Corbyn victory could have, as the series of victory in Greece could not have, given it's on the periphery, could have an impact on German social democracy, Swedish social democracy, maybe even help Mélenchon shift even the Social Democrats, the socialists in Spain, in such a way that the balance of forces might shift a little in Europe, so they'd find it more difficult to try to intervene that way. And in any case, people around Corbyn, strategists, say, well, what are they going to do? Send in the European army? We ignore them. Which I think is somewhat plausible. The second barrier is again not the European Union, it's the American empire. Far before, much more important than the European Union. And especially the security and intelligence apparatus of the American empire that the MI5 is so deeply embedded in, right? So that's the second barrier, right? The EU is a barrier, but it's only the third one, I think, right? That said, I think that the Corbyn leadership didn't mind the outcome of the referendum, provided they could have struck, not least for the kinds of reasons that Niko's pointing to, a deal with the European Union that established a very close relationship. I don't think they have illusions, as someone like Hillary Wainwright does, and a lot of the British left does, even some of the Marxist British left, that you can easily reform the European Union, the kind of Varoufakis position, right? So they would have been happy, I think, had they been able to carry it through, but instead they got trapped in the way that I talked about, partly by virtue of having done so well in 2017. That was the paradox. So I think they could handle Europe, even within it. The other stuff is more difficult. Should Corbyn win or lose is a very good question. I mean, the deflation of spirit and emotion is very dangerous if he loses. And the possibility of electing someone who doesn't have that degree of socialist commitment and doesn't have a group around them with that kind of socialist commitment would be dangerous. On the other hand, were socialists of that type to remain in control of the party, it might be better to lose. They wouldn't be caught in this position of having to call a second referendum, which would, I think, guarantee even more of their working class base would be lost. It would be the mess that Brexit is going to be. And they're going to, even with a hard no deal Brexit, they're going to be negotiating this over particulars for the next 10, 15 years. The degree of integration is so great, right? Even greater than it was in Greece, which was great enough. This is going to go on for a long time. So when it looks like a mess, Labour could then benefit, right? So there's a case for saying as far as next Thursday goes, worst is best. But in general, one doesn't want to take that position. As for Momentum, it's a very strange organization. It's primarily now a campaigning organization. That's what it emerged as. The reason it was created was that the people who ran Corbyn's campaign and surprisingly got him elected And he initially his speeches were, we're in this campaign to lead the Labour Party, not because we expect to win, but to show them that socialists are still a political force. We still have a voice. We still have something to say to the 21st century. He wasn't expecting to win. And then when people around Red Labour, et cetera, were able to mobilize all these people, they collected an incredible email list and contact list, which they didn't want to give away to the Labour Party bureaucrats after he won. So they created this organization called Momentum, which had this list, and that's how the 50,000 eventually were mobilized, and that's what happened. It's not an internally democratic organization. There was a big fight in it in the first year around having a democratic constitution. They did have to come to the position that you had to be a member of the Labour Party in order to be a member of Momentum, but they very much don't want to be a party within a party. They're not very good at political education, although they have been very good at mobilizing constituencies around progressive candidates in elections. About 25, 30 of them were selected, and around important resolutions at party conference. They've been very good at this. But there's a big campaign against the current leadership of Momentum because it's not very democratic. And there are people, especially, if you don't mind me saying this, people who've been in far left socialist groups and which are no longer viable in Britain, or very viable. They would like to recreate them within the framework of this struggle in the Labour Party. And Momentum would be an arena for having that struggle. Right? And they'd be very good at it at a local level because they're good cadre. They have a history of being good cadre. They've been trained as effective cadre. We know that. But that would turn Momentum into a fight between those who aren't in that tradition and those who are. So it's now a relatively undemocratic organization. Largely, the leadership emerges through some strange online balloting that I don't quite understand. The education stuff is being picked up by the World Transform, which was a spin-off. They're very effective people. In 20 places, including in working class areas, they have good education facilities going on, not just at the party conference. They're impressive. How they could extend that, I'm not sure. But yeah. Well, both John and Corbyn's points on having to get better on dealing with this is right. I do think we need to recognize that, by saying we need to recognize anti-Semitism as part of an anti-racist campaign. We need to learn from what's happened in the Labour Party. And that is that by bending over backwards, as Corbyn and Landsman have, and MacDonald, who was the one who first said they should accept the UNCR definition of what is anti-Semitism. Yeah. It was John MacDonald, the most Marxist of them all, right? Who tactically, said we have to do that, and then you dig your grave. Especially when you have so many activists who are subject to being called anti-Semites for being critical of Zionism. So it is hard to do. We better figure out exactly what we're doing. My own view is that, and I say this especially to Jews who have become, who want to be aligned with the Palestinian struggle and reject the two-state solution as, in the long run, inherently, racist in some ways. There is, I think, a lack of political priorities. There is a lack of tactical and strategic thinking because they open themselves up then to identifying, as I was saying, what they're struggling for with being anti-Jewish, insofar as so many Jews identify with at least a soft Zionism. This is hard to do, in other words. But I think John's right. We should be meeting on this, thinking it through, and trying to learn from what the Labour Party did wrong about this. As for what Momentum could have done, that's absolutely right. I think that even if Corbyn was trapped, if the leader's office was trapped, and it was dysfunctional all kinds of ways, first very disorganized, and then they put in someone who operated like a Stalinist bureaucrat in order to discipline them, and was, too super organized in a top-down manner. They had to be less focused on the leader and the leader's office, and less waiting for a lead from them, and been doing exactly the type of outreach and campaigning. And you felt that at that Labour Party conference that I was talking about, where you could see the effects of people dealing with this stuff, especially on Brexit, in a creative way, and it gave one some hope. Right? But how much that was done outside of Labour Party circles, outside of constituency Labour parties, is not at all clear, because the infrastructure isn't there anymore for political education. And they have to create it. But yes, they should have done that. I think that if in some ways that's the main failing. I think that's true. The hardening of the British state, I don't know. I do think that it's hard to say. I think that Johnson, if he is elected with a majority, will break with Tory austerity. Unless the break with the European Union is so devastating that they lose a good part of fiscal revenues, and then they'll respond in the typical reactionary way. The kind of hardening that is likely to happen is the kind of way he responds to the terrorism incident at London Bridge, which is, we should throw the key away once we throw these guys into prison, right? Which is so different from Corbyn's response to the much more horrible slaughter in Manchester during the previous campaign in 2017, where he condemned it and etc., but said this is a product of British imperialism. It's the way we got involved in the Middle East historically, and then especially after 2003, that leads to this kind of thing. And that was popular. I mean, there are ways of saying that are popular. So, if that type of thing is not voiced, then it does lay the basis for a more repressive and coercive British state. I think that you'd expect that out of someone like this. The really not surprising, I guess, thing is that the British ruling class, which is in the city, in the big bankers, in the major industries, is so tied into the global economy, is so tied into Europe especially. They are prepared to support Johnson and a hard Brexit, rather than have a socialist become leader of the Labour Party. And he's not a revolutionary socialist, as we all know. And the manifesto, for however good it is still a social democratic platform. It would be the start, possibly, of a coherent, gradualist socialist strategy at best, right? And yet, they see what really matters. And, they are prepared to go through all of the disruption that would be entailed, or take that risk. I think they hope they can restrain Johnson once he's elected, and go back to a soft Brexit at best. But it's really astonishing to see how the ruling class sees what's what in this election.
Cool. That's it. We're gonna.